Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle, a solutions-focused podcast about the economic challenges facing the Canadian middle class. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And our topic for today's episode is 15-minute cities. What are they, and why do they matter? Then we'll have a special guest, Vass Bednar, a professor of public policy from McMaster University. So Mike, start us out. What is a 15-minute city?
Well, it's this concept in urban planning that a household or a person, a family, should be able to walk 15 minutes or bike 15 minutes and get all the things they need. So be able to go to the grocery store, the hardware store, go to their job, that kind of thing. And it's a shift from post-war urban planning. So if you think of the neighborhoods that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had, this kind of sea of single detached homes in one area. Then you had commercial or retail space over here, and you had workplaces over there. And the only real way to go from one to the other was in some kind of vehicle. Maybe there was public transit, but most of the time, you would have to drive. So it's a big shift in the way that that people would live. And in fact, it's kind of similar to how we used to build neighborhoods 150 years ago. So I live in the Glebe in Ottawa, and I would consider that a 15-minute city where I have several grocery stores. I could go to the hardware store. I could go to the park with my kids, that kind of thing, all within a 15-minute walk, whereas the home I grew up in London, Ontario, other than the local elementary school, there was nowhere within a 15-minute walk. If I wanted to go anywhere, if I wanted to go to McDonald's or go to the movie theater, I'm hopping in a car. It's a real change in how we design cities, but it's actually a real kind of throwback to how we used to design cities back in the old days.
So is it created from a top-down approach, or does it happen naturally?
Well, actually, oddly enough, it's a little bit less prescriptive than the way we build homes. So it's all, in the past, we have, zoning type policies that say, okay, this is a residential area, and this is a retail area, a commercial area, and this is an industrial area, and so on. What a 15-minute city allows to happen is that you can have all in one, where you can have a bunch of homes and then near it some retail space, or you might have an apartment building with a bunch of stores on the first level. And it actually allows neighborhoods to change a little bit more organically. So it's actually, kind of oddly enough, it's a little bit less prescriptive than how we built homes in the latter half of or neighborhoods in the latter half of the 20th century, which was very, okay, this must go here, this must go here, this must go there.
So I see a lot of people online having a lot of fear about 15-minute cities. I guess it tends to be especially on the social network formerly known as Twitter, where people would talk about it being, the governments are going to trap you in your 15-minute city. You won't be allowed to leave it. Where did that come from?
Well, I think it's a few things. So, we look at some cities that have, road tolls, where it's the kind of thing where you go from one area to another and you might get assessed a fee. And go, okay, well, that's kind of government sort of forcing people to stay in one area or another. But I also think it's one of those ideas that's, liked by, the wrong people in some people's eyes. So it's the kind of thing that they might discuss at a World Economic Forum or a Banff forum where Vass and I have been a few times. So, on the sort of far right, they sort of see this and they start to piece all of these ideas together, where you have people discussing 15-minute cities at the World Economic Forum, and you've got cities who are putting in road taxes. This place, and like that meme, I think it was Always Sunny in Philadelphia, with the all the pictures and all the string going between them, that either just outright conspiracy theorists or bad actors kind of piece all of these things together into this idea that, we're going to have some form, 15-minute cities or some form of communism that's going to force you to live within or not be able to travel within like a kilometer of your home without needing a passport. So it's really generated all of these kind of conspiracy theories.
But that's not what we're talking about when you're talking about 15-minute cities.
No, not at all. What I think we're looking at is actually liberalizing zoning policies to allow for the type of neighborhoods that we used to build, back in the 20s and 30s. So, if you really want to know what a 15-minute city looks like go to the Glebe in Ottawa. There are a number of neighborhoods in downtown Toronto that are essentially 15-minute cities. So it's just allowing that in more places and not saying, okay, we're going to have these communities. But, if you want to live in a 15-minute city, you have to live in a home that was built 100 years ago in a variety of neighborhoods that have gotten really, really expensive because this type of living is really popular with people.
So if we want to talk about the middle class and how they're kind of being squeezed out, how do 15-minute cities play into that?
Well, I think there's a big challenge, again, because they're so popular right now. That the homes in those cities have gotten, or those communities have gotten really expensive. So we have to make sure that when we design a 15-minute city, or at least have the policies around 15-minute cities, that we make sure that, first of all, there's enough affordable housing, and we can define affordable a number of ways, but basically homes that young families can afford, but also that we have all the amenities, so the daycares, the parks, all of the things that a young family needs. So it's not just about housing and not just about retail, but having this combination of things. So some of those policies are obvious. They're like housing policies and policies around parks and things like that. But I think some of them are less obvious. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is how competition policy becomes far more important in a country or community with a lot of 15-minute cities. Because right now, like in car-centric design, you can, people are expected to drive long ways to get their groceries and things like that. So they can drive to any number of stores, or they have to drive to any numbers of stores. So that creates a certain level of competition. But if what you're saying is, okay, no, we don't want people to do, or we don't want people forced to do that. They can still do that if they want. But if we're not going to force people to do that, if we're going to say, okay, you should be kind of, we want to create the opportunities for you to shop in your local neighborhood and bike and walk, then first of all, let's take a pharmacy as an example. Well, first of all, you would want people to be able to walk or bike to 2 or 3 different pharmacies to create that level of sort of price competition. And that is also important because we're not just talking about consumer price, but we're also talking about jobs for pharmacists, right? That you want people, if I'm a pharmacist, I want to be able to, work at one, and then if I get a better offer, another one, go to that one and not have to sort of commute there. So that competition becomes important, and where that can be challenging is what happens when those 3 pharmacies are all owned by the same chain. That competition goes away, and you've created this situation where you're trying to encourage people to shop locally, but you've created all of these local monopolies that jack up prices and suppress wages. So I think competition policy, or the need for competition policy, is really underrated in the 15-minute city movement.
That nicely brings us to our guest today. Vass Bednar is the Executive Director, Master of Public Policy and Digital Society at McMaster University, and an adjunct professor of political science. She also writes a super fun Substack called Regs to Riches, where she's self-described as a generalist working at the intersection of technology and public policy. So welcome, Vass.
Thanks for having me.
So what are your thoughts on the 15-minute city?
Echoing a lot of what Mike said, on a 15-minute city, I think people do imagine also a lot of independent businesses and entrepreneurship and kind of personal connections with firms around them in their community. And that can be sort of missing, or it feels implicit in sort of what people are conjuring when they talk about that. And one thing you left out on your intro is that I'm on leave right now. I'm on parental leave. So a lot of my life feels like 15-minute city-ish because I'm walking a lot. I'm with the stroller. I'm calculating, or how far can I get? What's our time? And that's a different way it's just a different way to experience the place or places that I live. And I feel even more attuned to the diversity or lack of it of firms, you know, within a range of where people live. So those are just some of my quick reactions.
Whereabouts are you? Where do you live?
Well,
Which neighborhood?
I'm like, what's your postal code?
Which neighborhood do you live in?
Our place in Toronto is in the Corso Italia neighborhood. And right now, my geriatric millennial hack is that I'm living with my parents in Hamilton for help with my baby, to be honest. Yeah. So 2 places. Yeah.
Okay, so really, I was just thinking about it because
I'm bi-coastal.
Because you're saying about how it's kind of changed your mindset when you're going out there with your kid, and I think about that where like a lot of people think that you should be moving to the suburbs when you have a kid.
Right.
The idea that you're saying that being in a walkable neighborhood in a 15-minute city sort of style place is helpful.
It feels a lot harder to pack a small person up in the car just for a small errand, right? There's also that layer of e-commerce, which a generation ago for our parents' generation, my mom couldn't order some diapers online to get, you know, bring to the front of the house. Everything was, you know, just a chore or, you know, the time, I'm not going to say time tax, but, you know, there's how you allocate your time. And right now it does seem like I have all the time in the world, but that's not, I don't want to devote it to driving around places to buy things. That makes sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I add to that, you know, one of the big advantages for 15-minute cities is not just for parents, but the kids themselves, right? I think of growing up in the suburbs of London, Ontario. Like if I wanted to, I don't know, go get a pack of baseball cards or something, you know, I'm trying to get my parents to drive me there because, you know, I just can't do it, right? It's just too far away. So having these cities creates independence for kids where at, you know, 10 or 12 or whatever, you know, they can go to the store and they have a little bit of independence. So I know my good friend Jason Slaughter of Not Just Bikes talks about this. When he turned 16 years old and after that and got his driver's license, their big thing to celebrate was driving to Burger King, right? Because we couldn't do that where we grew up, right? Like if you actually just wanted to go get a hamburger, you had to go in a bus or go in a car. So having a 15-minute city is not just great for individuals, but it's great for kids as well.
That's such a good point. I mean, I think it opens up those third spaces in a different way too, right? When you're not just going from A to B, and third spaces, they're important for everyone.
What is a third space?
Third space, I'll probably do a botched, I'll give you my definition. So third spaces, I think of them, you know, think of adolescence. Where can you go and, you know, either not spend any money or spend a tiny bit of money and hang out, linger. Used to be arcades, sometimes the movies, you know, libraries, coffee shops.
Growing up in the suburbs, it was Tim Hortons.
It was Tim Hortons, or if you got one bubble tea place. It was the bubble tea place, or maybe or Booster Juice, let's be real. But those, you know, as we take seating away from places, as you lack, you know, park benches, those kinds of elements, those are taken away from people. And it's harder for those young people, however independent they may be, to be connected in a way that's offline. And for parents of all kinds, but of course I'm just focused on myself, my main area of expertise, you know, I'm always triangulating where can I also breastfeed and or do a diaper change without necessarily paying a premium. And if you want to talk more about that, that's a whole other episode I can do.
Okay. I guess I was when Mike brought up earlier about being worried about corporate consolidation in 15-minute cities, is that something you've thought about?
It's something I think about sometimes. You know, he brought up having 3 different pharmacies, or, you know, is it just the same pharmacy in every 15-minute city? And I think people are starting to become more attuned or curious about the range of firms that they either see or don't see, or the lack of choice that they feel when it comes to doing their own shopping. And that's a really important aspect too, which is why I sort of pointed to I think when we imagine 15-minute cities, part of the utopia or novelty or attraction is a more vibrant kind of hyper-local economy. But we're not thinking that there's just the coffee shop, the grocery store, that sort of thing.
Well, and I think we also have to be concerned about the sort of false choice. And I know this is something that you've talked about a lot, that, we could have 3 different pharmacies with 3 different names, but they're all owned by the same sort of parent corporation, you know, and I think that is a challenge as well. And we see that with so many of the consolidations that you've written about.
We see that. That's part of, I mean, one of the many things that grinds my gears, but the murkiness of marketplaces, right? So, you know, a rose by any other name. But, you know, when there's private label brands, when you don't understand who actually owns who the parent company is, it obscures the marketplace in a way that I think just fundamentally disadvantages all of us, or lets us pantomime competition in a way that is not actually authentic. So that's a really useful point too.
How big of an impact do you think corporate concentration is on the middle class right now?
Wow. How do you answer that? How big an impact? You know, I think we're getting, there's been a lot of momentum in Canada. I think we're moving beyond problem admiration, where we sort of have these memes about, hey, Canada's, what are the jokes, right? They're not even that funny. 3 telecoms in a trench coat. We've sort of grown. There was this period of time where we were kind of comfy with oligopoly in major sectors. And now with the pressures of inflation as well, I think people are starting to really pay attention to pricing and choice. And that means that they're starting to care about competition. It doesn't necessarily mean that they care about capital C competition policy. We do have this piece of legislation called the Competition Act, capital T, capital C, capital A. But there are other ways, right? Other levers, many other ways we moderate marketplaces. So how big an impact do I think it's having on people? I think the murkiness of marketplaces, not knowing who owns what company, not knowing when something is a private label brand, not knowing when a price has been set by algorithms or is, you know, based on demand-based pricing and is hyper fluctuating. All of those things incrementally hurt people. And when you take them in aggregate, I think we have a big problem. So for me, the problem isn't so much just, you know, Canada lacks competition, Canada needs more competition. Reviewing one piece of legislation is not going to revolutionize the economy, unfortunately.
Where do you see these, where do you see corporate concentration in Canada? You mentioned telecoms, but where else do you see it?
Sure. I mean, look, there are, I mean, people have been bringing up the grocery stores. Our Competition Bureau just did a big study on grocery in Canada to kind of understand pricing and margins. These things are really important. Bank of Canada just had that note from yesterday, which I decoded and tried to text my friends about. Telecommunications, banking, airlines. You know, I think we have 1, maybe 2 train companies. I'm sort of being a jokester, but we see it in these areas. And we've had a history in Canada where we have said, well, we're a smaller country, we lack the population. Let's sort of privilege international competition over international competition. Let's try to make national champions. Let's pick some winners here, because remember when globalization was like the thing? A little bit of a 90s throwback. It's still important. It's still important. But now with that layer of e-commerce and digital markets, it's a game changer, right? And that, you know, digital competition, you know, where else do I see consolidation? I see all these business tactics, mostly started by big tech companies, but that are emulated in all sorts of places because it's kind of a playbook that hurt smaller businesses, that hurt independent businesses, that increase the barriers to entry and just make it tough to compete. I mean, robust competition, no one disagrees that we need it or that it's desirable, right? Where people disagree is how to get it and what business behaviors are appropriate or not. And those are big debates that we're just starting to have in Canada, but literally everyone else seems to have figured it out.
One example people know about is grocery stores, right?
Sure.
You've talked about that elsewhere. You've brought it into people's attention, I think, and people are starting to realize how I guess the bread fixing scandal helped us realize how little competition there is in grocery stores. So like when you go grocery shopping, how much of what you're buying is how many options do you really have?
That's a great question. How many options do you really have? Look, the bread pricing scheme has colored in our minds and people often bring it up. But here's the thing, we're still patronizing those grocery stores, right? It's really hard to vote with our feet there or vote with our wallets and select against those firms. Hard for consumers to punish them, to say, well, I'm, you know, because you did this undesirable, frankly illegal, I'll use the word bad, is that a controversial term? Bad thing. You did a bad thing with this cartel-like behavior. People either don't feel they have the choice or it's not powerful enough to switch them away. So when we see a lack of competition, Mike mentioned, you know, prices. We don't see enough variability in prices. We tend to not see a lot of innovation. Can be a very nebulous word, but we know the largest Canadian firms significantly underinvest in R&D. So this is a phrase you hear a lot around competition. People will sort of be like, ha, 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 big isn't bad. Big is totally not bad. I want Canadian firms to get big too. That's great. That's intoxicating. That's why we have, that's exciting. But, it's what those companies do kind of with their size or with their market power, or what an entire marketplace looks like when you just have a handful of companies. So you're asking, what does it mean for the middle class? I think when we go back to food pricing, we've been asking really important research questions on profiteering. Are firms passing on the costs of inflation completely to consumers? And groceries, a very complex but very interesting place to look at because of all those other factors, right? It's not just widgets, right? Supply chains, geopolitical factors, climate change, all of these things affect the price of food. It's not just people kind of in a back room, like with a calculator or something, making a price. Yeah?
When you say profiteering, I keep wondering, like, what's the difference between making a profit and profiteering?
Okay, Mike, can you help me with this in terms of like a good definition? Profiteering.
I would say it's almost like the definition of pornography. It when you see it. Yeah, it is a challenge. It is absolutely a challenge to sort of understand. Okay, what is sort of a normal profit and what is above and beyond. I do think we sort of have to recognize that the companies are always going to have to, or always going to try and go above and beyond, right? So I think there's a rule for public policy to prevent certain activities, limit certain activities, and encourage others. And I would agree with Vass that I think we want big companies, or at least we want some companies to be large. But I think there's a fundamental difference between how they get big, right? Because there's really two ways a company can get big, right? The first way is to expand the size of the market, right? Just sell more things to more people and expand that way. And the second way is just to grow your margins. Right, so you can either sort of double the amount you sell or make double amount the money on the same amount of things that you're selling. And I think the concern is that we're often too much on the second one, that firms are getting more profitable, not because they're doing great new innovative things, not because they're exporting more and selling more to the Americans, but just because of what they were charging us $6 for last year has now become $7 or $8.
And what Loblaws would say is that they still are making the same percentages. It's just on a higher amount now, which is why they're making more profits. But the percentages haven't changed. They're still operating on razor-thin margins, according to them.
I mean, look, Loblaw, can someone write a book about Loblaw? Because I would read the heck out of it. It's a fascinating company, and we have to be careful not to only characterize it as a grocery, right? Because they've made the case to parliamentarians, and it's absolutely true that, and they're trying to make it the case to us as Canadians, right? Their profit gains have been largely kind of cross-subsidized from their pharmacy line of business. But there are many things, right? You can think of them as a technology company with their loyalty program. They're kind of a data company.
They're a bank.
They're a bank, right? They've got their telecom arm. There's really, really an interesting company. But yes, on the grocery element, I think that's where we sort of anchor and start to think about them. But I think the most important thing is just that we're able to ask these questions in Canada, and that's able to spur more research, and that these questions are in the public domain in a way that they never were before. And we do, I think, need to just zoom out and celebrate that. And we've seen great research, again, from the Bank of Canada, from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, ideas being batted around federally, both good and bad. Still really important, rather than having people just sort of continue in this like zombie-like Canada state where we just say, well, this is how it is because we're in Canada.
How do you even begin to solve this issue in Canada? Where do you start? Like, what's the lowest hanging fruit in your mind?
Okay, so for me, I want to go back to the murkiness of marketplaces and talk about the power of labels for a second, right? At the grocery store, lots of stuff, it's labeled. What are the ingredients? Where did it come from? I actually think that federal labeling law is like this amazing policy precedent for how to clarify, mostly digital, but just marketplaces in general. What do I want clarified? One, private label products. I want them to be labeled owned by. Doesn't mean anyone's going to read them. And I just wanted the clarity there.
Is it not on there somewhere in like small print somewhere?
Not.
I don't think it's required.
Not required. It's not required. Look, that's just a small thing. Back to digital behaviors, right? You can shop online for groceries too. I brought up online shopping before. I'm very good at online shopping, I like to think. Is self-preferencing occurring in the search, right? It's not just large technology companies that do this.
What does that mean?
So I know, sorry, I'm not being clear. When I search at Fortino's to buy my groceries, which is owned by Loblaw, I search chocolate chip cookie. First thing I'm going to search. I would like to be able to know two things. One, when President's Choice, are they called Chips Ahoy? No, that's a different brand. When President's Choice cookies come up,
Decadence cookies, I believe, are theirs, right?
you know it. When those cookies come up first in my search, and it's not a function of price and it's not a function of quality, as you know, if there are reviews, maybe, I want to know that that might be SelfPreference. That might be the company that owns that is showing me that first in search because they can. Because grocery stores, like large technology firms, can create and compete in the very same marketplaces. So to Mike's points earlier, you know, competition, using that word, competition policy, and me sort of saying we don't just need the Competition Act to have interventions that are meaningful, right? They can be modest but meaningful. Let me try to actually answer your question. What is the lowest hanging fruit for me? Again, transparency, clarity. Algorithmic pricing. I think it's very dangerous. I think it's deceptive. We don't always know where it's occurring. We've been...
What kind of pricing is that? Like, is that when it's like they change it depending on who's buying it or what time of day? Is that what you're talking about?
You got it. So we've become kind of desensitized to it with travel, airlines. We understand, okay, there's a certain amount of seats on this flight. If I, you know, buy my ticket late, or hotels, right, there's, you know, more demand, or, you know, whatever, the price goes up. There's elasticity. What is it? Secondary degree pricing, basically? Or like, try to be an economist here for you?
Yep.
Okay. With algorithmic pricing, it's hard to actually talk about where there's a line between an efficient economy, right, where if Mike's willing to pay $2 more for that, what do you want to buy at the grocery store?
I don't know, those chocolate chip cookies are pretty good.
If Mike's able to, because the algorithm knows that he's a white guy who lives in that really cool Ottawa neighborhood and he can't afford it.
The glebe tax.
And I'm living in this, you know, I don't know, right? My own demographic, or I'm in a different weird neighborhood, and I'm only going to buy those cookies if it's $1 less. You could, you know, there is an argument, of course, that's just efficient. That's maximizing the potential gains for a company. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's the way we want marketplaces to be and we're comfortable. But when we don't know that one person is getting charged a different price, I think it would be dangerous, and it would be wrong of us to assume that outside of things like travel, where we're used to second degree pricing, that prices are stable. And I think a lot of people presume that. It makes it really hard. It makes it impossible to price match, probably. And it makes it really hard to shop for deals. So again, we end up downloading all these, you know, that kind of price matching or maximizing your budget down on the shoulders of individuals. Kind of makes sense. You're the one doing the shopping. But again, in this digital era, what else should we be doing? And I'm trying to read books. I try to get to the finish line with books. I do my best right now because I'm a newish parent. But I was reading about Walmart and Amazon and their sort of price wars, right, to earn market share. If these companies can monitor prices in like near real time, and if we have plugins kind of for our browser and things like that to give you an alert when an Amazon price is much lower or something like that.
That does exist.
Exactly. But should the government be doing more to monitor and let us know about price dynamism or geographies where things are cheaper? Do we all have to be sort of super sleuths? I'm very curious what will come out of, I know we haven't had a capital R recession, but in the 2008 not a recession, you know what got really popular after? Extreme couponing. Remember that?
I remember it well.
Yes. So my question is, what's going to come out of this one, right? What are we going to learn about consumers, or what workarounds will consumers have to put together? I think that's important to pay attention to because I think it tells us about deficiencies in our marketplaces.
It's also really hard to keep track of all the different prices. I think of, you said you're a good online shopper. I feel the same way, where I'm like, I know how to monitor for things I watch. I know kind of like all the tricks to how to get the discounts on things. But then that takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of people who just do not have that time to invest to decide when they're going to buy their paper towels.
Right. When and also where, to Mike's point, how far do you have to go in that, however many minute city, where else are you able to go, that sort of thing.
As an economist, how do you, when you hear about dynamic pricing and these different algorithms that they use to decide how much you're willing to pay for something, like what are your thoughts? Is it fair?
Okay, so this is confessional time. This is what my PhD thesis is in, and
What?
yeah,
Uh-oh.
it is in dynamic pricing
Cool.
for the car rental industry. And in fact, some of the algorithms that I came up with have been used by car rental places. So,
Wow.
I'm actually probably part of the problem unwittingly. In my defense, I didn't get really paid for it, other than getting a PhD. So, yeah, but it is out there, and I think it is a challenging one. So basically, then the research I did was basically how can auto rental companies almost like more like discount their cars if they have too many on the lot because they'll kind of expire. So those things are out there. I think it's a transparency issue.
Yeah.
I honestly do believe that consumers should be told what's going on and let the consumer kind of go, okay, I'm comfortable with this or not so comfortable with it. But I also believe that it does ultimately come back to competition, right? That if there are 3 or 4 different, let's say, car rental companies I can go to, then if I don't like the games that one of them are playing, then I can go to some other one. And I think that's where it gets to challenge. So it's transparency in pricing and competition where I can kind of vote with my feet and go, okay, well, these guys are, their prices on their cars are all over the place. I'm going to go to this one. Might be a little bit higher, but I know, if I go to brand XYZ, that it's always, $59 a day, and I can count on that.
Yeah, I'm with Mike there in terms of, that question, what's the lowest hanging fruit? Where do we start? And I think if we bring that consumer lens to most marketplaces, some of the answers become actually quite clear, and you can sort of separate the thinking from, it's not about punishing a particular company or looking and favoring one sector over the other, but it's just recognizing these behaviors take place and they're either impossible or very challenging to decode, but well known, on the business side and well known in economics. But again, we're kind of blind to them, and I don't think that's cool. I think that's challenging. I think it's inappropriate.
That's it for today's episode. If you have any questions or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing Canada's middle class?
You can get in touch with me, Cara Stern, and Mike Moffatt, as well as our producer, Meredith Martin, and our guest, Vass Bednar, on all the social media channels.